Between them, qualia and phenomena give a complete description of a person and their consciousness, but not all phenomena are associated with qualia. There are things about us that we are not conscious of, yet still have associated phenomena. All features of consciousness, in fact all features of individuals, can be classified according to this diagram. The left-hand oval labelled qualia contains all the experiences that are available to the conscious person from their internal viewpoint. The right-hand oval labelled phenomena contains all the things that the individual can communicate to others. It is this phenomena oval that is the stuff of scientific inquiry into the nature of consciousness. Progress in consciousness science involves better understanding of phenomena within this oval and the expansion of this oval to include increasingly large amounts of Zone A. The qualia oval contains the content of consciousness. The phenomena oval contains the properties of individuals that can be observed by others. Scientific inquiry can only use these phenomena as its substrate. Zone B contains qualia that are associated with phenomena. This diagram does not use the strict rules of set theory, because Zone B contains qualia that are associated with phenomena. It is not meant to imply that the qualia and the phenomena that they are associated with are the same thing. Qualia in Zone A can only become the subject of scientific inquiry if Zone B expands to include them. While they remain in Zone A, they cannot be investigated with science for several reasons. Science involves defining phenomena that can be repeatedly observed. It is important that the repeated observation of the phenomena does not vary from one observer to another. The qualia in Zone A cannot be observed by anyone except the conscious person themselves, so there is no possibility for them to be repeatedly observed by others unless their nature can be communicated, in which case they enter Zone B. What is in Zone A is the expression gap. That is, the difference between the full content of consciousness and what can be communicated from one person to another, or what can be placed in the public domain. There is a secondary issue in the expression gap, which is that there are many things that can be expressed from one individual to another by appealing to common conscious experiences, but that cannot be brought into a specific language and description that is amenable to the methods of science. If we consider the common philosophical question about the orangeness of the colour orange, there are qualia to the conscious experience of seeing something that is orange, which are not expressed by simply telling another that it is orange. These qualia we cannot put into words, and they are in the expression gap. We have all experienced orange, and you can surmise what I mean by the extra qualities of orangeness that cannot be expressed in words. In this way, I can invoke some of the understanding in you about what I'm talking about by calling on your past experience of orange and asking you to consider those aspects of that experience that you cannot express in words. Because we are able to communicate this to other people, it is not really part of the expression gap. But those qualities that we are discussing are still beyond the realms of scientific inquiry, because they cannot be explicitly stated, and specifically cannot be stated in such a way that they are fully understood by somebody who has never experienced orange. Arguably, the most powerful communication between individuals involves not the communication of new qualia, but the invocation of qualia we have already experienced. In fact, that this mode of communication is not available to science is in large part why many people find science so boring. Science does not have qualia per se, but in order to communicate understanding of scientific principles, existing qualia are often invoked. This is the frequently used teaching method of analogy. Not only is it widely used in teaching, but analogy also forms the basis of much scientific progress. Some of the most difficult scientific problems have been so intractable because no existing satisfactory analogy existed. And these problems include the problem of consciousness. Whether it is possible for the phenomena oval to expand so much as to include the entire qualia oval is a good question. As language, art and other modalities of communication develop, could this gap be narrowed? Languages vary in their complexity and vocabulary. English in particular has borrowed widely from other languages in order to develop fine shades of expression and meaning. It is now a richer language than it was 400 years ago, and perhaps this has narrowed the expression gap. Also, the technology of expression has changed markedly in the last 100 years. Images are easy to create and communicate, as are sounds. Perhaps this too has narrowed the expression gap. I'm guessing that you do not find these particularly convincing examples of how the expression gap may have narrowed. Were this a real process, you'd expect to find much more familiar and convincing examples scattered over the past decades. In reality, it's hard to argue that our ability to communicate the content of consciousness has bettered that of Shakespeare some 400 years ago. It may be that we're rather slow at closing the gap, or it may be that something else is behind it. The development of language, or any communication modality, requires that what is expressed has a recognizable meaning to the people transmitting or receiving the information. In practice, for linguistic or artistic idioms to catch on requires that they carry a significant meaning for a proportion of the population that is greater than a critical value. One explanation for the rather unimpressive narrowing of the expression gap is that the content of Zone A is not common to a sufficiently large proportion of people to develop a common formalism for it. This doesn't mean that it could not be done without a specific effort aimed at developing tools to study consciousness, but it does mean that, left to themselves, language, art and music would never narrow the expression gap much. This leads to two competing ideas about the expression gap. The first is that qualia are not unique to individuals, but are common to many people, and that as time passes we develop improved methods of linguistic expression, art, technology and psychometric inquiry, and consequently we narrow the expression gap. The second is that qualia are unique to individuals, and the expression gap is not a function of the limitations of our communication modality, but is rather a consequence of the difference between the consciousness of different individuals. In this latter theory, whatever the sophistication and lucidity of modes of expression, they will only find traction when expressing qualia that are common to the individuals communicating. For qualia that are not common to multiple individuals, the expression gap will remain intractable. If we do differ in our consciousness, then cultures of communication will converge on common qualia, but those qualia that are rare or unique to individual people will never be expressible. Anyway, to get back to the expressibility of orange, there is a distinction here between the orange question and the problem of Frank Jackson's Mary the Colour Scientist. Frank Jackson is an Australian philosopher who proposed Mary as part of an argument against state-state identity theory. But she is also useful for our purposes. Mary is a hypothetical colour scientist working at some future date when the human visual perception system and associated science has been entirely characterised, and she knows everything there is to know about the subject. She was born into and lives in an environment of black and white and shades of grey, but no colour. One day she walks into the real world and perceives colour for the first time. Jackson's argument goes that at this point she learns something new about colour. She already knew all there was to know about colour, so therefore could not learn something new if state-state identity theory were correct. And she did, so it cannot be correct. Without getting into state-state identity theory, it's pretty clear that Mary does learn something new. What she learns is what's in the expression gap about colour, because that was never part of science. If we close this expression gap completely, then she would learn nothing new. So she has learned new qualia that are in the expression gap. This is associated with new phenomena, because now, when we ask Mary if she's seen colour, she says yes. Perhaps a more interesting example than seeing colour is to choose something that we can experience, but that we are much poorer at communicating what those experiences are. For most of us, a good example of an experience that is difficult to communicate in language is that of tasting wine. Wine tasters use a range of colourful but fairly non-specific words to describe the taste of wines in print. You may be able to match the text with the wine if you're experienced in this field, but most of us would not be able to. However, that is not to say there is no difference between different wines. Given 3 glasses of wine, of which 2 are drawn from the same bottle and a third from a different type of wine with a similar colour, it is very likely that even an uninitiated taster could tell which of the 2 came from the same bottle. Imagine I take one of the 2 identical glasses away. I ask you to taste the 2 wines, and to describe what they're like in such a way that I can recognise which wine is which from your words. Not impossible, but far from easy. This example enables us to draw a clear distinction between our internal viewpoint of consciousness of the wine and the external viewpoint we have by inquiring of others what their experience of the wine is. The difference is one of difficulty of putting taste into language. This may simply be that English is a language of underdeveloped taste vocabulary, or, more likely, it is because taste is a sense that the brain finds more difficult to translate into language than vision. Note that Mary's problem is the true meaning of the scientific expression gap. The orange and wine problems are confounded by our ability to draw on previous experience of the same thing. One final thing. The expression gap may be narrowed, but it can never be closed completely. And so it stands to keep philosophers entertained for as long as there are philosophers.